A convoy of black SUVs rolled slowly through the streets of a small, forgotten town in the American heartland. The engines barely made a sound, but every head on the sidewalk turned anyway, because cars like that didn't belong in a place like this. After 25 years, billionaire Richard Bennett had come back, and not to stay, not to remember, but simply to sell the old family farm before catching a flight to a meeting in New York City. While he waited for his lawyer to unlock the gates of the property, Richard sat back against the leather seat and looked out at the town square. That was when he saw her. A thin young woman in plain, worn clothes, standing behind a small folding table, trying to sell homemade pies to people who wouldn't even look at her. Nobody bought anything. Some walked past like she wasn't even there. A couple of teenagers laughed as they passed by. When she finally began packing up the pies to leave, an old man standing beside Richard's car glanced at her, then at Richard, and said quietly, "That's your daughter." Richard laughed, assuming it was some kind of joke. Then the old man added, "Her mother died waiting for you to come back." The ground seemed to disappear from under Richard Bennett's feet. He had never known he had a daughter. For a long moment, Richard didn't move. He sat frozen behind the tinted glass of the SUV, watching the young woman fold up her table with quiet, practiced hands, the kind of hands that had done hard work for a long time. The old man beside him didn't rush to explain further. He simply stood there leaning on a wooden cane, watching Richard's face crumble in real time. "Say that again," Richard finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man turned to him, his eyes tired but steady. "Emily Carter. You remember her, don't you, Mr. Bennett?" Richard's throat tightened. Of course he remembered Emily. 25 years hadn't been enough to erase the memory of her laugh. The way she used to sit on the porch of the old farmhouse, with her bare feet swinging off the steps. The way she used to say that someday they'd build a life together, right here in this town or somewhere better. It never mattered where as long as they were together. He had promised her he'd come back. He had promised a lot of things. "I need you to tell me everything," Richard said, stepping out of the car despite his driver's protest that they were already running late for the airport. The old man, whose name was Walter Higgins, had lived in this town his whole life. He'd known Richard's father, had known Emily's family, had watched the whole tragedy unfold from his porch 2 doors down from where Emily used to live. "Emily got pregnant not long after you left," Walter said, his voice heavy with the weight of a story he'd clearly wanted to tell someone for a long time. "She tried to reach you. Lord knows she tried. She wrote you letters, dozens of them over the years. She'd walk to the post office every single time with that same hope in her eyes, thinking maybe this would be the one that reached you. But they never did they?" Richard shook his head slowly. "I never got a single letter. Not one." Walter nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Emily raised that girl all on her own. Grace, that's her name. Emily worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. She never remarried, never really moved on from you, if I'm being honest. Folks in town used to whisper about her, say she was foolish for holding on to a memory of a man who ran off to become a millionaire and never looked back. But Emily always said you didn't know. She always believed that if you knew, you would have come." His voice cracked slightly. "She passed 4 years ago, cancer. Fought it for almost a year before it took her. And that girl you just watched folding up her pie table, she's been fighting to survive on her own ever since." Richard felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had buried under 30 years of boardrooms and business deals and cold, calculated success. He looked back toward the square, but Grace was already gone, disappeared around the corner with her folding table tucked under one arm and a box of unsold pies under the other. "Where does she live?" he asked. Walter studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this rich man standing in front of him deserved an answer. Finally, he pointed down the road, past the old hardware store and the boarded-up movie theater. "Carter Street, small blue house at the end, the one with the crooked mailbox. But Mr. Bennett, if you're thinking of walking in there with your driver and your fancy suit and trying to buy her forgiveness, I'd think twice. That girl doesn't want your money. She's never wanted anything from anybody. She's got more pride than half the men I've known in this town." Richard barely heard the warning. His mind was already racing, replaying 25 years in fast motion, trying to understand how none of this had ever reached him. He'd built an empire. He had lawyers, assistants, People whose entire job was to manage his correspondence, his properties, his affairs back in this very town, since his family still owned land here even after he left. Someone, somewhere, had made sure those letters never made it past the town limits. And as that thought settled into his mind, another name surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. Victor Hale, his late father's old business partner, the man who had stayed behind to manage the Bennett family's holdings after Richard left for the city. Victor had written to Richard occasionally over the years, always about business, always about the farm, the land, the investments. Never once had he mentioned Emily Carter. Never once had he mentioned a child. Richard told his driver to take the car back to the hotel instead of the airport. The New York meeting would have to wait. He walked the rest of the way to Carter Street alone, his polished shoes kicking up dust from the cracked sidewalk, past houses that looked like they hadn't changed in decades, past neighbors who peered out from behind curtains, recognizing the Bennett name even if they didn't recognize the man himself. When he reached the small blue house with the crooked mailbox, his hands were shaking. He knocked twice before the door opened, and there she was. Grace, up close now, her eyes the exact shade of green that Emily's used to be, her jaw set in the same stubborn line he remembered from arguments he'd had with her mother decades ago. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, guarded. The voice of someone who had learned a long time ago not to expect kindness from strangers, especially not from men in expensive suits. "My name is Richard Bennett," he said, and watched her face change instantly, not with recognition, but with something colder, contempt. "I know who you are," Grace said. "Everybody in this town knows who you are. The rich man who used to own half the county and never bothered to visit." She started to close the door, but Richard stepped forward, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Grace, please. I just found out. I swear to you. I just found out 5 minutes ago that you exist." Grace's hand froze on the door. "Found out what?" she asked slowly. "That you're my daughter," Richard said. "That your mother was Emily Carter." "I didn't know, Grace. I swear on my life, I did not know." For a moment, Grace just stared at him, searching his face for the lie she was certain must be there. But there was no lie in Richard Bennett's eyes, only devastation, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to grief. "That's impossible," she said finally, her voice trembling despite her attempt to keep it steady. "My mother wrote you letters for years. She told me. She said she wrote to you every single time something happened. When I took my first steps, when I started school, when I got sick with pneumonia, when I was 7, and she thought she was going to lose me. She wrote to you and you never answered. Not once. Not one single letter in 18 years. Richard felt like he'd been struck. "I never received them," he said quietly. "I need you to believe me. I would have come. I would have come the very first day if I had known." Grace laughed, a short, bitter sound with no humor in it at all. "That's what they all say, isn't it? The rich men who leave and never come back, they always have a reason. They always have someone else to blame." She stepped back and shut the door in his face, the sound of the lock turning like a gunshot in the quiet street. Richard stood on that porch for a long time, staring at the peeling blue paint, listening to the creak of a loose shutter in the wind. He didn't leave. He sat down on the steps, right where the old man said Emily used to sit with her bare feet swinging, and he stayed there until the sun went down, until the porch light of the neighboring house flicked on, until his phone buzzed with a dozen missed calls from his office in New York that he ignored, one after another. He wasn't leaving this town. Not tonight. Not until he understood everything that had happened, and not until he found some way, any way, to make Grace believe him. The next morning, Richard checked into the only hotel the town still had, a modest inn on Main Street that hadn't seen a paying guest in months, judging by the surprise on the receptionist's face. He called his assistant in New York, cancelled every meeting for the week, and told his legal team to start digging into the old Bennett family correspondence records. Every letter, every piece of mail that had ever come through the family's business office in this town over the past 25 years. Then he went looking for Walter Higgins again, because the old man clearly knew more than he'd said. He found Walter sitting on his porch just like the day before, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands despite the summer heat. "Didn't expect you to still be in town," Walter said, as Richard climbed the porch steps. "Figured you'd have run back to your skyscraper by now." "I need to know everything," Richard said. "About Emily, about Grace, about who might have kept those letters from reaching me." Walter studied him for a long moment before gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down then. This is going to take a while and you're not going to like most of it." Walter explained that after Richard left town 25 years ago, his father, old Harold Bennett, had grown too sick to manage the family's businesses and land holdings, so he'd handed the day-to-day operations over to his most trusted partner, Victor Hale. At the time, Victor was just a local businessman, well-liked, well-respected, the kind of man who shook everyone's hand at church on Sunday. But over the years, as Harold Bennett's health declined and Richard stayed away chasing his fortune in the city, Victor slowly, quietly, began expanding his own control over the Bennett family's assets. "Started small," Walter said. "A parcel of land here, a building there, always with some paperwork that made it look legal, always signed off by your father when he wasn't in his right mind anymore, God rest his soul. By the time your daddy passed, Victor Hale owned or controlled damn near half of everything that used to belong to your family. And nobody questioned it, because you weren't here to ask questions." "And Emily's letters?" Richard asked, his jaw tight. Walter took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "The Bennett family always had a private post office box downtown, the one your daddy set up so all the farm correspondence and business mail would go through one place before being forwarded to wherever you were living at the time. Victor Hale had the only other key to that box besides your father. I always wondered how a diligent young woman who wrote so many letters, so consistently over so many years, never once got a reply, never even got a letter marked, 'Return to sender.' It's like they vanished into thin air." He looked directly at Richard now. "I think you already know where I'm going with this, son." Richard felt a cold, sick fury building in his chest. Victor intercepted them. "I can't prove it," Walter said carefully, "but I've had 25 years to watch that man build himself an empire out of land that should have stayed in your family's name, and I've had 25 years to watch that poor girl and her mother struggle, while he drove around town in cars almost as nice as the ones you rolled up in yesterday. You do the math." Richard spent the rest of that day at the old Bennett family business office, a squat brick building on the edge of town that his father had used for decades. He found the property manager, a tired-looking woman named Sandra Coleman, who'd worked there for 15 years, and asked her to pull every old file related to the family's mail records and property transfers. What he found over the following days chilled him to the bone. Dozens of properties that had once belonged to his family had been transferred to holding companies with Victor Hale's fingerprints all over them, sold at fractions of their value, always during the years when his father's health was failing, and Richard himself was thousands of miles away building skyscrapers and closing deals he thought mattered more than home. And buried in a locked filing cabinet in the back office, wrapped in a rubber band gone brittle with age, Richard found a stack of returned letters, dozens of them addressed to him, postmarked over nearly 2 decades, every single one of them marked with a small red stamp reading "Undeliverable," a stamp that Sandra Coleman told him, with visible unease, wasn't even an official postal service marking at all. Richard sat alone in that office long after Sandra had gone home, holding those letters in his trembling hands, unable to bring himself to open them yet, terrified of what Emily's words might say, terrified of what it would feel like to finally hear her voice after all these years, knowing now that she had spent nearly 2 decades trying to reach him and had been silenced every single time by a man his own father had trusted. The next day, Richard went back to Carter Street. This time, Grace didn't answer the door right away, and when she finally did, she looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed red like she hadn't slept. "I told you yesterday I don't want your money," she said before he could speak. "I'm not here about money," Richard said. "I found the letters, Grace, your mother's letters. Someone stole them before they ever reached me. I have proof." He held out the stack, his hands still trembling. Grace stared at the bundle of yellowed envelopes for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she snatched them from his hands and slammed the door in his face again. But this time, she didn't lock it. Richard waited on the porch, the same way he had the day before, and after nearly an hour the door creaked open. Grace stood there with tears streaming down her face, one of the letters open in her hand. "She wrote about the pneumonia," Grace whispered. "She wrote about how scared she was, how she prayed every night that you'd come, how she used to tell me stories about you, even though I never believed a word of it, because you never showed up." Her voice broke completely. "Why didn't you come? If you didn't know about the letters being stolen before now, why didn't you at least come back to check on her? You promised her you'd come back for a visit. Everyone in this town remembers you promising that." Richard had no good answer, and he knew it. "I got caught up," he admitted quietly. "I told myself I'd go back once I'd built something worth coming back to. I told myself there'd be time. I was wrong, Grace. I was so wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, starting with you if you'll let me." Grace didn't invite him in that day, but she didn't slam the door again either. It was a start. That night, alone in his hotel room, Richard finally opened the letters himself, one by one, in the order Emily had written them. The first one was dated barely 2 months after he'd left town, full of hope, full of plans. Emily writing about a doctor's appointment and a due date, and how she couldn't wait to tell him in person once he came back to visit like he'd promised. The second letter carried a different tone, quieter, more uncertain, asking gently why he hadn't written back yet, wondering if his new life in the city had simply swallowed him whole. By the 10th letter, spread across nearly 3 years, Emily's handwriting had changed, tighter, more guarded, no longer asking why, but simply reporting, almost like a diary entry addressed to a man who might never read it. Grace's first tooth, Grace's first word, which had been heartbreakingly dada, said to a photograph Emily kept on the mantel because she refused to let her daughter grow up without at least a picture of her father. Richard sat on the edge of that hotel bed until 3 in the morning, reading every single one, weeping in a way he hadn't allowed himself to weep since he was a boy, understanding now with brutal clarity exactly how much had been stolen from all 3 of them. Over the following 2 weeks, Richard stayed in town, extending his hotel reservation indefinitely to the visible frustration of his New York office, which called constantly demanding his return. He showed up at Carter Street every single day, sometimes just to sit on the porch steps, sometimes to help fix the crooked mailbox or the loose shutter that had bothered him that first night. Grace remained guarded, but slowly, in small and reluctant ways, she began to let him closer. She told him about her mother's final year, about the chemotherapy treatments they couldn't fully afford, about the diner where she'd worked double shifts just to keep the electricity on. She told him, with a bitterness that still cut deep, about growing up believing her father simply hadn't wanted her, about the birthdays and school plays and graduation ceremonies where she'd scanned the crowd out of habit, always hoping, always disappointed. "I used to think you were a monster," Grace admitted one evening, sitting across from him on the porch as the sun set behind the old grain silo down the road. "Now I don't know what to think. Knowing you didn't get the letters doesn't erase 25 years, Richard." She still couldn't bring herself to call him Dad. "I know," Richard said softly. "I'm not asking you to forgive 25 years overnight. I'm just asking for a chance to be here now, and for the rest of whatever time we have left." During those same 2 weeks, Richard began to see, up close, exactly what his daughter's life had looked like while he was building glass towers 1,000 miles away. He followed her, at a respectful distance at first through her days, the early morning shift at the diner on Route 9, where she poured coffee for truckers and farmhands before the sun was even fully up, the afternoons spent cleaning houses for families in town who paid her in cash and rarely looked her in the eye, the evenings baking pies at her kitchen table using her mother's chipped rolling pin because it was the one thing of Emily's she refused to ever replace. One evening, Richard offered to pay off the small mortgage still owed on the blue house on Carter Street, and Grace turned on him with a fury that surprised even her. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice shaking. "Everything in this house, every splinter in that porch, every dollar of that mortgage my mother earned with her own 2 hands after you left. I won't have you erasing that with a check." Richard raised his hands and backed down immediately, and something in the way he did it without arguing, without insisting he knew better, seemed to soften something in Grace, if only slightly. It was the first time, she'd later admit, that she believed he might actually be trying to understand her, instead of simply trying to fix her. It was during this same period that Richard finally worked up the courage to visit Emily's grave, tucked in the small cemetery, behind the old Methodist church at the edge of town. Grace came with him, though she stood a few feet back, watching him kneel in the grass in front of the modest headstone, watching this powerful, wealthy man break down completely for the first time in 25 years. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered to the stone, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have come back. I should have never let anyone or anything keep me from you and our daughter." Grace found herself crying too, standing there in the cemetery, watching her father grieve a woman he had genuinely, deeply loved, and for the first time, some small, cautious part of her heart began to soften toward him. But not everyone in town was pleased to see Richard Bennett digging through old records and asking questions about property transfers from 25 years ago. Victor Hale had heard within days that Richard was back in town, and within a week he'd heard that Richard was going through the old family business files with the help of Sandra Coleman. Victor requested a meeting, all smiles and old familiarity, inviting Richard to dinner at his large modern house on the outskirts of town, the biggest house in the county now, bigger even than the Bennett family farmhouse had ever been. "Richard, my boy," Victor said warmly, pouring 2 glasses of expensive scotch as they sat in his study. "It's been far too long. Your father would be so proud of everything you've built." Richard studied the man across from him, this man he'd once called family, searching his face for any sign of the guilt that should have been there. "I found some letters, Victor," Richard said carefully. "Letters that were supposed to reach me over the years and never did, marked with a stamp I've never seen the postal service use." Victor's smile flickered just barely, just for a fraction of a second, but Richard caught it. "That's strange," Victor said smoothly, recovering quickly. "I'm sure it was some kind of clerical error at the post office. You know how these small-town operations can be, always understaffed, always making mistakes." "The letters were kept in a locked cabinet inside the Bennett family business office, Victor. The same office you managed for 25 years while my father was too sick to run things himself. The same office where dozens of our family's properties were somehow transferred out of Bennett ownership and into holding companies I'm starting to recognize as yours." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victor set down his glass slowly, his charming mask slipping just slightly to reveal something harder, colder underneath. "Be very careful, Richard," Victor said, his voice low. "You've been gone 25 years. You don't know this town anymore. You don't know what it took to keep your family's affairs running while you were off building your empire in New York. Everything I did to protect the Bennett name. You stole from my family," Richard said, standing up. "You stole from Emily. You kept my own daughter from me for over 2 decades." Victor's eyes went cold. "I did what needed to be done. Your father was a sick, dying man who couldn't manage his own affairs anymore, and you were nowhere to be found. Someone had to keep things together. And frankly, Richard, a small-town girl and a farmhand's daughter showing up in your life would have been a distraction you couldn't afford back then. I was protecting your future." The confession, disguised as a justification, hung in the air between them like poison. Richard felt his hands curl into fists. "You'll regret saying that to me," he said quietly, before turning and walking out of Victor Hale's house without another word. Richard immediately called his legal team in New York, the same team of forensic accountants and corporate lawyers who had helped him navigate the most complex business deals of his career. He gave them everything: the letters, the property records, the holding company names Sandra Coleman had helped him trace back to Victor Hale. Within days, the lawyers confirmed what Richard had already suspected. Victor Hale had systematically defrauded the Bennett family estate over more than 2 decades, forging signatures during Harold Bennett's decline, using his position of trust to funnel property after property into shell companies under his control, all while deliberately intercepting Emily Carter's letters to ensure Richard never returned to interfere with the scheme. But Victor Hale wasn't a man who went down quietly. Word came back to Richard through Sandra Coleman that Victor had been making calls of his own, calls to old contacts in the county records office, calls to a lawyer of his own, and worst of all, a visit to Grace's small house on Carter Street, where he'd apparently made some kind of veiled threat about how reopening old wounds might not be good for anyone, especially not for a young woman who had no idea what she was dealing with. When Richard heard this, He rushed straight to Carter Street, panic rising in his chest, terrified of what Victor might have said or done to frighten his daughter. He found Grace sitting on her porch steps, pale and shaken, clutching something tightly in her hands. "He came here," she said before Richard could even ask. "That man, Victor Hale, he said I should tell you to stop digging into things that don't concern you, said some things could get complicated for people who go looking where they don't belong." Richard sat down beside her immediately. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I never wanted him anywhere near you." "It's not just that," Grace said, her voice trembling now for a different reason. She held up a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and worn with age. "I found this in the attic yesterday, going through Mum's old boxes. It's her diary. I never knew she kept one." Richard's breath caught. "Have you read it?" Grace nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes again. "She never stopped loving you, Richard. Not once. Not for a single day in 25 years. She wrote about you constantly, even near the end, when she was so sick she could barely hold the pen steady. But there's something else." Grace flipped to a page near the back of the diary, her hands shaking. She wrote that she started to suspect toward the end that someone in town was intercepting her mail. She'd asked around the post office, and an old clerk told her, off the record, that Victor Hale had been seen picking up mail from the Bennett family box regularly, even mail that wasn't addressed to him. She never had proof. But she wrote that she was scared of him, Richard. She wrote that she thought he was capable of far worse than she ever imagined. Richard felt a fresh wave of fury and grief crash over him. Emily had suspected the truth, had lived her final years afraid of a man who had stolen not just letters, but an entire life, an entire family, from her and from Grace. "We're going to make this right," Richard said, taking Grace's hand for the first time, and for the first time she didn't pull away. "I promise you, Grace, Victor Hale is going to answer for everything he's done." The confrontation that followed didn't happen quietly, in a private study over expensive scotch. It happened at the county courthouse, 3 weeks later, in front of the town's district attorney, a forensic accounting team Richard had flown in from New York, and at Richard's insistence, in front of as many of the town's residents as could fit into the courthouse gallery, because he wanted everyone who had ever looked down on Grace Carter, everyone who had ever whispered about Emily raising a fatherless child, to hear the truth with their own ears. Victor Hale arrived defiant, flanked by his own lawyer, still wearing that same practiced, charming smile, the same smile he'd worn at church socials and county fairs for 25 years, the smile of a man who had never once been told no. "This is a witch hunt," he announced to the gallery before the proceedings even began, loud enough for the local newspaper reporter scribbling in the front row to hear every word. "Richard Bennett disappears for a quarter century and comes back thinking he can rewrite history because he doesn't like how this town survived without him." A ripple of uncertain murmurs passed through the gallery, and for a moment, Richard worried that some of the old loyalty Victor had built up over the decades might still hold. But then, the district attorney began laying out the evidence, and Victor's confidence started to erode piece by piece. First came the forged signatures, blown up on a projector screen. Harold Bennett's shaky, medicated handwriting from his final years, compared side by side with the crisp, steady signature on property transfer documents dated during the exact same months, a forensic handwriting expert testifying that the two could not possibly belong to the same man. Then came the shell companies, a tangled web of names Victor had clearly hoped would take investigators years to unravel, all of them traced back through a single shared filing address, Victor Hale's own accountant's office. And then finally came the postal clerk, an elderly man named Earl Whitfield, who walked slowly to the witness stand with a cane, glanced once at Victor Hale, and said plainly, for the record, that he remembered Victor coming by the Bennett family post office box regularly for over 15 years, sorting through the mail himself before anyone else could touch it, and that he'd once seen Victor pocket a stack of envelopes addressed in a woman's handwriting and toss them straight into his car without a second glance. "I always wondered," Earl said quietly, "but a man like Victor Hale wasn't someone a mail clerk in this town ever felt safe questioning." Victor's composure cracked piece by piece with every word. Victor's composure cracked piece by piece, his smile fading into a snarl, then into panic as the district attorney laid out charges of fraud, forgery, and theft that would very likely see him spend the remainder of his life behind bars. "For you have no idea what you've done," Victor spat at Richard during a recess, his voice low and venomous, no cameras or lawyers close enough to hear. "I built this town while you were off chasing money in some glass tower. I gave your family's name, meaning long after you'd abandoned it." Richard looked at him, unmoved, unafraid. "You didn't build anything, Victor. You stole it, and you stole 25 years from my daughter that I can never get back. That's a debt no amount of money or power will ever let you repay." He turned and walked away, back toward the gallery where Grace sat waiting, her eyes red but her spine straight, watching the man who had shaped so much of her painful childhood finally face consequences for what he had done. In the weeks that followed, as the legal proceedings against Victor Hale moved forward, proceedings that would eventually result in his conviction and the full restoration of the Bennett family's stolen properties, many of which Richard immediately signed over into a trust for Grace, something else began to heal alongside the legal battle. Richard didn't return to New York, not yet. He rented a small house just down the road from Carter Street, much to the surprise of his New York colleagues, who had never seen the relentless billionaire slow down for anything or anyone in 30 years. He learned slowly, patiently, how to be a father, showing up not with grand gestures or extravagant gifts, but with small, consistent acts, fixing the loose porch step, learning how Grace liked her coffee, sitting with her at the kitchen table while she practiced the recipes her mother had taught her, the same pie recipes that no one in town had wanted to buy just weeks before. One evening, sitting together on that same porch where it had all begun, Grace finally looked over at Richard and said quietly, "I read the whole diary, you know, every page." Richard nodded, waiting. "She wrote something near the very end that I keep thinking about," Grace continued, her voice soft. "She said that even if you never came back, even if you never knew about me, she didn't regret loving you, because loving you gave her me, and I was the best thing that ever happened to her." Her eyes filled with tears. "I think I understand now why she never let go of hoping, and I think I'm ready to stop being so angry at you for something that wasn't actually your fault." Richard felt his own eyes fill with tears, 25 years of guilt and grief and hope finally breaking loose all at once. "I don't expect you to call me Dad," he said softly. "I just want the chance to earn it, one day at a time, for as long as you'll let me." Grace was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the quiet street, at the town that had shaped her whole life, at the porch where her mother used to sit with her bare feet swinging off the steps, dreaming of a man who would someday come home. Then she reached over and took her father's hand. "Okay, Dad," she whispered, testing the word for the first time in her entire life. "Let's start there." By the time autumn arrived, the town had changed in ways nobody could have predicted just months earlier. Victor Hale was gone, awaiting sentencing in a county jail 2 towns over, his once grand house sitting empty, already being sold off to pay restitution to the families and businesses he'd defrauded over the years. Sandra Coleman had been promoted to run the Bennett family's restored holdings honestly and transparently, with Grace, at Richard's gentle encouragement, learning the business alongside her, discovering a sharp mind for numbers and negotiation that she never knew she had, a mind that was in many ways exactly like her father's. Grace's pies, once ignored on that lonely folding table in the town square, were now served in a small bakery Richard had helped her open on Main Street, a bakery that quickly became the most popular gathering spot in town, packed every morning with the same neighbors who had once walked past her without a second glance. Richard never went back to living the way he used to, chasing the next deal, the next skyscraper, the next headline about his growing fortune. He split his time now between his business obligations and this small town he'd once abandoned, learning every single day how to be present in a way he'd never allowed himself to be before. He visited Emily's grave often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Grace, always leaving a small pie from the bakery beside the headstone, a quiet tradition that felt, to both of them, like the closest thing to making amends that time would ever allow. Walter Higgins, the old man who had set everything in motion with 4 simple words on that first day, became something like a grandfather figure to Grace, and Richard made sure the old man never wanted for anything for the rest of his days. A quiet thank you for finally telling the truth after 25 years of silence. The town itself slowly began to heal too, the way small towns do, gossip fading into genuine warmth as people watched a broken family stitch itself back together in real time, right there on Main Street, for anyone willing to pay attention. Some nights, sitting together on that same porch, Grace would ask her father questions about the years she'd missed, about what he'd been doing on her birthdays, on her graduation day. During the nights, she cried herself to sleep, wondering why he didn't want her. And Richard answered every single question honestly, without excuses, without flinching away from the guilt those answers carried, because he understood now that the only way to truly earn back 25 lost years was through complete, unflinching honesty, one conversation at a time. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, father and daughter built something neither of them had ever expected to have. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect reunion without scars, but something real, something earned, something built on truth instead of the lies that had kept them apart for so long. If this story moved you, if you found yourself hoping for Richard and Grace with every twist and turn, do me a favor and let me know down in the comments. I read every single one, and I love hearing which part hit you the hardest. If you haven't already, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need a little hope today. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next story.